Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. I'd like to start by saying salam to both of my guests, Saqib and Suhaib. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So let's pick up from where we left off yesterday, and we were going to finish off reading Genesis 41, and I think we got up to 14. No, not 14. We got a lot further than that.
I just had a couple of thoughts, Ustad, if I may, about the stuff we did last time.
I would love for you to say stuff about last time. Go ahead.
So if you remember, we noted that when Pharaoh asks Joseph about his dream, he sort of first introduces, in the biblical account, he says, I've had this dream and no one can interpret it. And Joseph says, God will provide the interpretation. And we noted that rather counterintuitively, you have in the biblical version, Joseph sort of appealing to God. And in the Quranic version, he sort of just gives the dream, which is not what not the pattern you usually see, right? And usually you see a greater involvement of God.
Yes.
So there's a couple of things that sort of come to mind. So firstly, in the Quranic account, Joseph isn't first. There isn't like an introductory formula. The servant who goes to see Joseph, he doesn't say, "I have a dream and I want you to tell me." Pause, which allows Joseph to respond and say, actually, it's not me, it's God who's going to give the dream. He just gives the dream in the Quranic formula, and so Joseph just responds with, well, here's what it means. The second thing is, previously, the same guy, when he was in prison, Joseph was very proactive, right? He not much more proactive than he's in the biblical account. He sort of approaches him and says, well, they approach him, and immediately when they approach him, he brings the conversation to
and part of that is
right. Yeah.
So he already established that as the source of his knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah. With the same person.
With the same person. And what's really nice is when he does it the first time round, he kind of this phrase, really interesting phrase, "La ya'tikuma ta'amun turzaqanihi." Right? So you won't. Food will not come to you before I've. So I know what your take on it is, but I think what he's saying is that this is. Look, I'm just going to take a little bit of your time here, and tell you some really important stuff. It's not even going to distract you from your dinner when it comes to you.
Right.
So he's being really brief. He's letting them know that I'm not going to preach to you. So he said his piece to this guy already, and now he's come to him again. And he's not going to, he said, look, I've already told this guy what he needs to know. And he's not going to hassle him again. So I think it's maybe a continuation of that same sort of same theme.
My mind never went there, but what do you guys think of just even the language? La ya'tikuma ta'amun turzaqanihi, being an interesting foreshadowing of food not coming later on in all of Egypt.
Yeah.
It's a very subtle, but it's the entire theme is food running short, and food not coming until he tells them something. So it's kind of it's pretty interesting that language is there, and it echoes in a much larger way later on. Very cool. Alhamdulillah. So we left off at Abrech, which you said is right at 44, which is some high lofty word for people of caliber, I suppose.
Well, we don't. It seems to be an Egyptian loan word. So some people have tried to connect it to the root barakha, which is like in Arabic meaning to kneel. So said it means kneel before him. But I think my impression is that most scholars are not on board with that. And as with several Egyptian loan words in this passage, we really don't have a very good idea what it means. Contextually, it means something like make way or hail or something like that.
I see. So I'm going to keep on reading from there. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. Without you, no man shall raise hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as wife. I feel like very Lord of the Rings right now, but okay. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Okay, so let's get these names sorted. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so these are, again, right, they're very Egyptian names. They reference all kinds of gods. So Potiphar, we've already had Potiphar, right? So
like I read a conspiracy theory on Wikipedia, right? That says that Potiphar might be the same person as Potiphar, and there's some discussion or debate around that. What do you make of this? Because the idea is, okay, we have a name here for the minister, which is Potiphar, and then later on you've got the daughter of Potiphar being given to Yusuf in marriage. Now, in the tafsir accounts, a lot of times at this point they will discuss some narrations that that Yusuf married the wife of the Aziz because he died, and then he marries her. I don't. It's very hard to see what the basis of this would be. It's maybe just something that seemed like, you know, something that, you know, an idea that circulated and then it turned into riwayah. In a way, it helps to kind of make a happy ending to that unfortunate sort of sequence of events that happened at the beginning of the surah. You know, that, you know, at the end of the day, she had this love, and then she gets some kind of happy ending for herself. And maybe even if you looked at it as, you know, he وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا, so there was something that, so attraction and so on, which would have been illegitimate to follow up on at that point. But then later on it becomes legitimate because she's no longer married to the Aziz. So maybe there's some attraction to being, you know, to advancing this idea, but I don't see that there's evidence for it. But what's interesting is that the biblical account has Potiphar's daughter rather than Potiphar's wife. And I'm just wondering what you think about those who at least saw Potiphar and Potiphar might be referring to the same person. Is there anything in that?
I don't think so. I don't think there's anything in that. So Potiphar is...
Wikipedia is not an accurate source.
Sorry?
Wikipedia failed us. What a surprise.
Yeah, worldview is crumbling all around me right now.
Yeah.
So, no, I don't think so. So firstly, this guy Potiphar is introduced, right? He's priest of On. And so if it was the same guy as earlier, there'd be no need to introduce him. Secondly, he's priest of On. He's not, doesn't have the same job description as the guy who was at the start of the story.
Yeah.
Thirdly, you know, Potiphar, the guy at the start of the story, that name, it's again, these are Egyptian names. It's difficult to make out exactly what's happening. But Potiphar, probably, you know, this name that we're looking at now probably means the one given by Ra, the sun god, right? So Wahab Ra. And Potiphar, the early one, is probably a shortened version of Potiphar. So what the narrator seems to be doing in the story is consciously making a difference between the names by shortening one of them, just to alert you to the fact that they're not the same people. So there's so many indications, I think, in the text to say they're not the same people. But at the same time, the fact that you have this throwback, right, to this earlier name, I think is significant. I think the narrative is kind of saying that, you know, he kept himself chaste when in Potiphar's house, and now God has given him something better in Potiphar's house, right? It's given him a legitimate wife in Potiphar's house. So I think there is this kind of literary connection that the author's making, but it's not the same Potiphar.
There
I don't see anything for
another
that.
literary connection, which is that Potiphar in one case is a political figure and in the other is a spiritual, saintly type of figure. And it may speak to the social hierarchy of that ancient society where political figures are a form of the elite and influential class, but so are this priestly class. And they share, in a sense, name as in they share class. And what further substantiates that is his advisors include not just advisors, but actually sorcerers and priests and people of that nature. So,
right,
you know, these people of the temple, if you will, are actually pretty high caliber in this religious hierarchy.
Yeah, and owned, you know, Heliopolis. Modern Heliopolis that was a major city. So this is not just any old priest. He's one of the main priests at one of the main temples. So this is clearly someone who's very high in Egyptian elite society. Yeah.
Do Jewish scholars talk about the marriage of Joseph to someone who was from a pagan religion?
Oh, really great question. Yeah, I'm sure they do.
That's a curious question for you to later look into.
Yeah.
And do they believe that the Abrahamic tradition, because I mean, there's no law of Moses yet, right? So
Right.
does the Abrahamic law, as far as they understand it, include prohibition of one marrying someone who doesn't believe in the God of Israel?
So in the biblical account that you see that with Ezra, right? So this is when after the exile, the Babylonian exile, the temple is destroyed, right? The first Solomon's temple is destroyed,
Yeah.
And the Jews of Judah, the territory in which the temple is located, have been exiled, taken away in captivity to Babylon.
Yeah.
And then the Persians free them, and they come back under the leadership of Ezra. And Ezra initiates all kinds of religious reforms. And it seems that it's from his era that you get much stricter marriage rules. And so the prohibition of marrying outside of the community probably dates from him.
Okay.
But what you do see with the rabbis, and it makes me think that there probably is something here. I'm sure there is something here. Is this real desire to project back onto the patriarchs, onto Abraham and so on, the idea that they kept the law. You already see that before the rabbis, with like people like Philo, because it's just so inconceivable to them that the patriarchs wouldn't have kept the law. So you know, there are various explanations for how that can be, but then there are all these difficulties that they fall into, you know, especially when it comes to marriage.
To get
you do have to do a lot of gymnastics, yeah. But there is an effort nonetheless, and I'm sure over here as well there'll be something, but I'd have to look into that. That's a really great question.
So the bottom line is, and I wanted to make this clear to our audience, those of you that are following this series on Yusuf alayhi salam, the most common question in social media is, did he end up marrying her? Did he end up marrying her? Did he end up marrying her? And I want to just make sure that what you said, Suhaib, has been echoed and clearly understood by our audience. There is no verifiable evidence that that's the case. It is a popularized version of the story that isn't actually traced back to something as a historical or even a sacred record. So that is conjecture for the most part. And one reading of it can be, like you said, the happy ending. She redeems herself. And there's an entire account. I was reading a Tabari, I believe, in which when she comes before him, Yusuf alayhi salam says to her, allegedly, isn't this better for you? And all of that, like the halal way, etc. And, you know, there's even a mukalama between them, a dialogue between them, none of which is actually verifiable, none of which is actually traceable, even from our traditional point of view. It's popularized, as are many things in tafsir, which become, what's crazy to me is these things become as substantiated as actual words in the Qur'an, right? So like the popular version of the story in the mind of most Muslims is, this is what happened.
Sometimes far more, because people, okay, sorry to be negative like this, but people don't necessarily memorize the Quran as much as they circulate poems and songs and you know, popular artistic representations, which have contained a great deal of elaboration on what's called the Yusuf and Zulaykha narrative, right? So the surah is really not about Yusuf and Zulaykha, if we even know her name is Zulaykha, which we don't. Even in the tafsir, it says her name is either Zulaykha or Ra'il, right? So like it's not even any legend between these two names, right? So Zulaykha is the one that kind of caught on more and spread more, is more popularly known. But these things, even the tafsir, are fairly chaste in their you know, amount of content that they have in this regard. They do contain these narrations. Again, it's just like, it is narrated that, it is narrated that, and it's just a case of, okay, this is something that's been said. That's all. That's all. You know, you're not supposed to build things upon it, but because it's got a certain interest from an artistic point of view, a storytelling point of view, so it catches on, and then those things become part of popular culture. And sometimes people don't know, well, what does the surah actually say, and then what are the things that we can also extrapolate and elaborate from the surah. And that's what I hope also the wider process of what we've been doing over the past couple of months and continuing to do is really just helping people to understand, well, this is exactly what Allah's words are, and these are some things that we reckon can follow from that, and that we can derive from that.
Yeah, and one of the purposes of engaging in this kind of inquiry is to actually reinforce what the primary text says and what other traditions, including previous scripture, what of that aligns with what we have come to understand, and what of that can possibly align, maybe doesn't align at all, and even if it does, the mindset needs to be clear. And to me, it's really more about mindset than it is about this information. And the mindset, when it switches over from us learning from this surah and learning guidance from this surah, when this becomes about an interesting story, then the kinds of inquiries, the kinds of questions that are being asked are very telling about what's the thought process behind somebody's inquiry. Right. And that's really something that I want to have, everybody challenge for themselves. Why are we engaging in this inquiry? And it's okay if we don't know that they got married, or they never got married, or you don't believe that they got married. Astaghfirullah al-azim. That's okay.
Yeah. It's the Surah Kahf thing all over again, right?
Exactly.
How many were there?
Surah Kahf thing all over. Okay, so I'm going to keep on reading. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. This is an interesting parallel to يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ. So he's able to set himself wherever he wants. And it also, correct me if I'm wrong, Sahib, it's extrapolation doesn't just mean he can, build his home or move into whatever mansion he wants in whatever neighborhood, but wherever he goes, he sets the legislation, people answerable to him. It doesn't matter if it's the marketplace or the farmland or whatever else, he is the top, authority to answer to. So when he goes somewhere, he is the final authority in Egypt. And that's the Qur'an's way of putting that is yatabawwa. As if he's not a visitor, this is it, as if he has control over something, as if it's his house, his own house.
Literally, he can come and go as he pleases. He's not going to be questioned about that, and that is such a big contrast with being an enslaved person. Unable to do anything without asking permission. Rather, he can do as he wishes. He will not be asked. So that's a way of expressing authority.
And even prior to that, so when he was in Canaan, in his dad's house, his dad basically had him under house arrest because he's worried about what his brothers are going to do to him. So he had kept a close watch on him as well. He couldn't get the ball out there either. So now he's really found a lot of
There's
power.
a direct contrast with his previous lifestyle. Yeah. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and passed through all the land of Egypt. And the land in the 7 years of plenty made gatherings. And should I keep reading what he did?
Yes.
Okay.
You can keep reading.
And the land in the 7 years of plenty made gatherings, and he collected all the food of the 7 years that were in the land of Egypt, and he placed food in cities, and the food from the fields around each city he placed within it. And Joseph piled up grains like the sand of the sea very much until he ceased counting, for it was beyond count.
So this should be a throwback, right? So when we come across language like this, like the sands of the sea and it being beyond count, this is a throwback to the covenant with Abraham in the Bible, that your seed will be like this. So it's a real connection between, and remember we said part of that covenant was that the blessing of your seed will spread to all the nations. And you see that now happening with Joseph.
Literally seeds.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Very cool. So this is actually, the Quran simply makes an allusion that he's going to take charge of this responsibility, and we assume that he's going to execute. And the Bible is actually opening it up. And this is actually a running theme when we compare Quran and biblical accounts, is that the Quran will take very long, drawn out explanations, elaborate storytelling in the Bible, and squeeze it into a phrase. And it's almost as if that one phrase is the entire stories behind it, and it's just encapsulated in, Hafizun Alim or something like that, and that's what I feel that's happening here. Is if somebody did have knowledge of Quran and they read this, they're like, what is behind all of that is that claim that he made when he presented himself to the king. So. But this is something we don't have in the Quran. And to Joseph 2 sons were born before the coming of the year of famine, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore him. And Joseph called the names of the firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has released me from all the debt of my hardship and of all my father's house. And
So
the name
maybe we can just pause there for a second. So
do it.
this is this particular translator wrote out his take on things, because the name is a bit slightly problematic. It's from the root nasa is nasia. So most translators would say he named his firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget my hardship and my father's house. Right, so there's a problem there. Why would he he seems to be celebrating the fact that, oh, I've sort of left that behind me. I've sort of not forgotten my father's house now. You could maybe spin it to mean that I've forgotten the hardships of my father's house and what I went through in my father's house. But the translator here has clearly spotted there's like a difficulty in that, because you don't want Joseph to forget his father's house, and also the second name is so positive. He wants the first name to be positive as well, as we'll see. Ephraim is a very positive name. So he sort of found a rarer use of that root and said it's about relief from debt,
an opportunity to
rather than forgetting.
Share a very vivid contrast with the Qur'an, because when he spoke to the inmates,
that's exactly what I was going to. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. So it was
اتبعتم
really
ملة
interesting.
إبراهيم
Yeah.
وإسحاق ويعقوب.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So far from forgetting his house, he's and that again is really interesting. So you'd think that surely the thing to do is to call these people to Tawheed, but he's calling them to very specifically to kind of Ibrahim alayhi salam and his Tawheed. It's really interesting.
It is, and it's also interesting that he, when I talked about the prison scene from the Qur'an's point of view, and it brought me to think about that, because the name here means some kind of release from hardship, and he, ذَلِكَ مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ عَلَيْنَا وَعَلَى النَّاسِ. Like, he's in prison, and he's talking about the favor Allah has done on him by having him be part of this sacred heritage. And he sees himself as blessed, and then says most people aren't grateful, as if you should be grateful too if you can take on this favor. So and he even started by talking about things that he's blessed with, like ذَلِكُمَا مِمَّا عَلَّمَنِي رَبِّي. And he's talking about not I'm rotting in prison and I used to have a better life, but rather إِنِّي تَرَكْتُ مِلَّةَ قَوْمٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. Like, I left them. Like, and I haven't been thrown here. I left them. Like, I left something bad. Like, anybody else would be like, bro, you're in prison. What do you mean you left something bad? You are in something bad. But he's talking about how he's in a better place comparatively, and how he's blessed. Right? So it's a pretty interesting language that he chose to talk about. And one of the shocking things for the inmates would have been, why is this person so positive and feeling like he should be so grateful in this environment?
Right.
It's like he introduced them to Alhamdulillah before he introduced them to Allah. So, but that stuck out to me when you said that the name itself is about, oh, Allah has released me from my hardship. But there can be some reference. It's not a denial of that necessarily.
Right. But like I think that the name, I think the majority opinion, I think, is clearly it's about forgetting. That the root of the name has to do with forgetting. God has made me forget my hardship. He's made me forget my father's house. This is this particular translator's take on it. I mean, he may be right. I'm not enough of a biblical scholar to kind of jump between them, but
someone who would make someone forget,
minority opinion,
the Arabic point of view, would be a munsi.
Right, yeah. So,
right.
Yeah. Well, this is So this is probably related to the fa'ala form, Manasseh. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but you have the PL form in Arabic, which in Hebrew, which is the same. You have like a shut down the middle root.
Taf'il in Hebrew.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So cool. I'm talking about the Arabic geek out.
The expression when Yusuf alayhi salam is expressing gratitude for being brought out of the prison is later at the end of the Quranic story. وَقَدْ أَحْسَنَ بِي إِذْ أَخْرَجَنِي مِنَ السِّجْنِ وَجَاءَ بِكُم مِنَ الْبَدْوِ. So like all that expression of relief and happiness really occurs once he's reunited with his family, once his family have been brought back. then he expresses all this in that beautiful dua, almost at the end of the surah. Because without that, I was almost, I was thinking in my mind as you were speaking as well, and I think we reflected on this earlier, that in a way, like, the prison seems to be among the safest times of his life, when he was put away from the immediacy of that fitna, when he'd said, "Rabbi Sijnu ahabbu ilay," the prison is more beloved to me, i.e., compared to this situation that I'm in. I'd rather be in prison than fall into sin. And then when he's called to come out of the prison, he's also hesitant about coming out, because he needs to make sure it's safe out there. He feels at least he's in a place where he's at least protected from those certain things until he comes out. But then it's at the end, then you really see the obvious thing, which is that he sees it as God's favor and blessing on him, that he brought him out of the prison and united him again with his family. So that's household, really, but he's seeing it, that being united with his household is really the thing that, together with being out of the prison, is the relief.
So I'm going to keep on reading to the second.
Just one more point for a minute. So there's also...
Quit asking, Saqib, just say it.
Own it. Old habits die hard. So there's
right. It makes me feel awkward.
That's more or less my mission in these.
I'm just conversations, and you're like so nice. Okay, so anyway, go ahead.
Just a tangential point, I suppose. So Neil Robinson has an interesting point here in his what was discovering the Quran. He notes that this thing that Yusuf alayhi salam says, "Inni taraktu millata qawmin la yu'minuna billahi wa hum bil akhirati hum kafirun." Is that how the ayah goes? So he says this is interesting, because the ancient Egyptians, out of all the ancient people, had the most vivid kind of belief in the hereafter. We have kind of hieroglyphs after hieroglyphs of them. This is why mummification was such a big deal for them, and being buried with their possessions was such a big deal for them. And even this idea of the heart being presented to a scale was such a big deal for them. So they clearly had a belief, some sort of belief in the hereafter, and yet Yusuf alayhi salam saying وَهُمْ بِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ كَافِرُونَ. So it's interesting that at that point he brings in kind of his heritage, right? What's about millata Abai Ibrahima wa Ishaq. So as if to say that there's that belief in the Akhirah, right? But which is tantamount to not believing in the Akhirah, and there's the belief in the Akhirah which I'm an inheritor of, right? Through Ibrahim alayhi salam, which is really nice.
That is a really amazing contrast, and because the Egyptian heritage is also an ancient one. Well, actually, there's an alternative ancient heritage that goes back to sacred names like Ibrahim. So one sacred history, allegedly sacred history, being contrasted against another sacred history.
I mean, just to further support that reading of it as well, that la yu'minuna billah, in the Quranic language, when it talks about this, believing in God wrongly and associating partners tantamount to
not believing in God.
It doesn't refer to atheism. When you're saying la yu'minuna billah, it doesn't necessarily refer to not believing in the existence of God, but believing in him with false beliefs is described in a number of ayat as not believing in Allah.
Can I just put you on? Can I put you on? Be horrible and put you on the spot there, Sheikh. So could you give an example of an ayah where that happens? Because I'm sure you're right.
At-Tawbah verse 29. You can look it up later.
Okay, so how about this? What I was thinking about, this is kind of blowing my mind. The Egyptians believe in a hierarchy of ascension and all of that, and they probably attribute that to their kings or godlike humans.
Right.
And the highest a human being can actually achieve is prophethood. So in these two histories, you've got the history of kings and self-proclaimed gods and all of that, maybe, or high priests on the one end, and then Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ishaq alayhi salam and Yaqub alayhi salam. It's like Allah is the contrast is that of people who actually believe in the Akhirah, but in the position of ibad, the best of Allah's slaves, prophets. So prophets versus kings almost.
Yeah.
That's been done here.
Yeah, and because immediately after he mentions kind of his pedigree and his ancestry, he says, "What's the ayah? Ma kana lana an nattakhidha min
And nushrika, yeah.
an nushrika bil-" So these are my ancestors, but these are not the ancestors who I'm calling you to worship, right?
Yeah. And
as
as you
opposed
would
to
be
kind of
proud of a royal heritage, here he is proud
Right.
of a prophetic heritage. And the contrast is also interesting. People who don't believe in Allah may be in a high place like kings in this life and then lowly in the afterlife. And here you have prophets that may be in prison or expelled from home like Ibrahim alayhi salam in this life and be in the highest positions in the akhirah. Right? So there's this like opposing view of what history, what legacy you should be proud of. It's very powerful. Okay, so I'm going to keep reading. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And you want to say something about Ephraim?
No, just that is from the root.
Okay.
A fruit. So yeah.
Is a root from what?
A fruit. Paris fruit.
I see. And the 7 years of plenty that had been in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. And there was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. And all the land of Egypt was hungry, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all of Egypt, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, you must do." And the famine was over all the land, and Joseph laid open whatever had grain within and sold provisions to Egypt. And the famine grew harsh in the land of Egypt, and all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to get provisions, for the famine had grown harsh in all the earth.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there. So it makes it very clear that even though this was the Pharaoh's dream, it's connected to the Nile, connected to cows, the sacred animal of Egypt, the text makes it very clear that the famine affected a much wider area, right? And you're just kind of given that to understand in the Quran, that this famine must also have affected his brothers back home because they're also coming. So that's kind of made explicit. And then the other thing is, what is Joseph laid open whatever had grain within it and sold provisions to Egypt, right? So that's going to become important as we go forward. So this isn't charity; he's selling the provisions.
So let me ask you this: does it sound? Does the Al-Mufassirun say that he was selling provisions or giving them away as like welfare?
They describe it in terms of selling, if I recall correctly, because it was like they talk about it in terms of like once this type of currency had run out, then they moved to the next, and they moved to the next until they had nothing left.
So the idea of each person getting a ba'ir worth, a camel's worth.
Yeah.
So there was a selling limit. Is that what it is? Like toilet paper?
Yeah, I think it's along these lines. Let me just find the part where this is described. Okay. So in the first year, or it's mentioned here that the king became Muslim. It's mentioned here in Tafsir al-Razi. Again, not stated by the Quran, but just mentioned in Tafsir. In the first year of drought, he sold food to the Egyptians in exchange for dirhams and dinars, until they had no more to spend. In the second year, he sold for jewelry and precious stones, and then livestock in the third year, and then land in the fourth.
That's amazing. That's the biblical account, right? So that's what's going to happen.
After that point, they bought food with their freedom. Such as they all in slavery for years. Is that what it also says in the Bible?
Yeah. That's really nice.
My God, we have the king more powerful than this one, to whom all people have become enslaved. When he heard this, he said, "I call God to witness that I have released every last Egyptian from bondage and returned all their possessions." So this was at first what he did. He would not allow any buyer to take more than one camel's load, lest the provisions deplete for other people. This is narrated by the author of Al-Kashaf, which is Zamakhshari. Wallahu a'lam.
So our traditional scholarship read the Bible quite a bit.
Well, yeah, again, it's a question of sort of what was the route by which it came this way. So I don't get the impression that Imam Razi is reading the Bible, nor do I really think that Imam Zamakhshari was, although he could have been.
Actually, he's quoted the Old Testament on occasion, hasn't he?
See, we're definitely finding quotes that are almost word for word what's in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Whether they were reading it directly from a written copy of the Old Testament, or whether it circulated in other ways.
I don't know why it's somewhere in the back of my mind, الَّذِي يَجِدُونَهُ مَكْتُوبًا عِنْدَهُم.
Yeah.
Seed of that, I somewhere in my head, I remember this was maybe a decade ago, but I think that there is reference, like Arabic references in our classical tafsir to literally excerpts from the Bible.
Well,
maybe it was Razi or Zamakhshari, one of those two.
Not in most tafsirs. I mean, the one that really stood out by the fact that he did that was Al-Biqa'i.
Al-Biqa'i, yeah.
But other than that, so Razi, I noticed, this is in volume 1 of the Great Exegesis, at one point he just says, the beginning of the Bible, the first verse of the Bible is, and then he just quotes something which is just totally not the first verse of the Bible. Or it starts with Bismillahi marhiyanan or something, right? So he was just basically saying that, I've heard that the first verse is very similar to the Basmala, right? Very similar to Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the thing is that if he had a copy, he could just reach over and check that, but instead he wrote down what sort of was. I don't know why it was that difficult. I have a feeling that he could have. I mean, he went and he traveled a lot and he debated a lot of people from a lot of sects. So I don't know why the Christian bit didn't happen or the Jewish bit didn't happen quite so clearly.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Well, so also it's not necessarily the case that, I mean, the Bible was translated into Arabic, but we don't know how widely available that would have been. A lot of Arab Jews and Arab Christians would have been multilingual. They would still have been using, not necessarily all of them would have needed an Arabic Bible, even if it was translated. So its availability might have been quite limited. And if I can just give a shout out to my friend Sam Ross, who's done his doctoral dissertation on this topic of the use of biblical quotes in tafsir. So it's a really, really great study, and what he shows, hopefully be published in another year or two, it's really from the 19th century that you just get this explosion in direct quotation from the Bible, and before that you have just outliers like Biqa'i. And so what happens in the 19th century? You've got the publishing press, you've got missionary activity. So suddenly now Mufassirun have access to a Bible, which it's not at all clear that prior to those sorts of changes that they ever had.
And yet we find classical, early Islamic scholarship on the Qur'an quoting things that sound verbatim impressions of biblical reading, right? Like Razi's quote right now.
Yeah.
So clearly there was stuff coming. There were converts coming in from the earliest times, right? And that continued. Even some senior, you had Franciscans converting. You had some very senior ulama amongst the Jews and Christians converting. So they would have brought biblical knowledge into the community. And so, it's not surprising that there's some very precise understanding of the Bible. Even it's really interesting. Ibn Kathir, for example, when discussing the golden Innaha Bakratun Safra, when Musa alayhi salam is commanding the Israelites to sacrifice a cow, he says it's a yellow cow, and he says that's really strange because in the Bible it's a red cow. And he says, maybe there's some translation issue here. I don't really know what's going on. But it's really interesting. He knows that there's this kind of discrepancy.
Wow.
So there are kind of, these kind of scattered hints that quite precise bits of knowledge are around. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like there was.
Things like, for example, when they discussed the father of Ibrahim, he's called Azar in the Quran, and then they were sometimes saying, but according to the Bible, he's called Tarih. So how do we understand this? And then some discussion happens around that. Again, it's just an awareness that there's such and such information amongst the people of the book or in the Bible.
So, one thing that I wanted to point out that speaks out here as we reach this end of 41 is that the Quran goes from ayah number, I believe it's 50. Okay, so in 57, we've got him exonerated from prison and he's out and all of that. And what I haven't done discussion on, and so you and I are going to get into that this week, inshallah, is وَجَاءَ إِخْوَةُ Yusuf. The brothers of Yusuf came, which the Bible describes as an event that takes place 7 years after the good ones are over and now the bad ones have begun. And perhaps not even immediately after, because then it spreads to all the other lands and it gets much worse to the point where, that people are now coming to buy food. So the Quran skips that entire timeline discussion, and we assume that 7 years have gone by, food's run out, and that's why his brothers from Canaan are coming, and they don't recognize, and they're coming obviously looking for food, and that's the context is making it very clear that that's the case, even though it's not spelled out that way. But here, so sometimes we notice, and this is an interesting contrast. Sometimes we notice the Quran is opening something up that's absent in the biblical version, and sometimes the Quran is skipping entire portions of the story that are very elaborately spelled out in the Bible. So there's there are parallels, but there are some very interesting contrasts, not just in content, but also in what is stressed on in the story and what chapters of the story, if you will, are skipped. What scenes are skipped.
I mean, in a way, like, so there's no mention here about him having children and so on, but وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ. It's just in a kind of just overall way, a summarized way, just refers to
somebody having tamkeen and tabawwu,
which if you connect it with it extended for 7 years before the next bit happened. So there are 7 years in which but they would have been hard at work, because that's exactly what he says. You're going to be harvesting, you're going to be storing, we're going to be preparing. So it's a busy time, but in some way a happy time before the hardship hits.
Yeah. SubhanAllah. It's just the brevity of the Quran. As we study the Bible, it's how the Quran, in very succinct, very, very concise phrases, captures so much. He can settle wherever he wants. We settled him. Can include him getting married. It can include him having children. It can include him getting the work done in all these different parts of the land. And like all of that can actually just sum up inside this phrase. It's pretty amazing.
Even just like, I don't know, we did discuss the ayah, but I didn't look at it from this angle. So thinking about this ayah, 56.
56, okay.
As being, as referring to these years of plenty, and how in this time, there is rahmah. And Allah says, نُصِيبُ بِرَحْمَتِنَا مَن نَشَاءُ.
Yeah.
It's God's will according to when there's going to be plenty and when there's going to be hardship.
Yeah.
And even وَلَا نُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Allah Azza wa Jalla is also saying that we are storing up their reward.
That's interesting.
Oh, wow.
And beautiful.
The time when the people had to be storing the grain and the food for the time when they were most.
That's so beautiful.
Nice.
Oh my God, Sahib, give virtual social distancing hug. That's incredible. Alhamdulillah. We reached the end of 41, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so that concludes our discussion for this portion. So, Heb, you and I are going to get to work on 58 onwards, inshallah, for tomorrow. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Inshallah, ta'ala, make dua that we are able to complete our study of this surah and that good comes of it. Allah gives us a clear and good understanding of it that we can bring into our lives and you can bring into yours. Barakallahu li wa lakum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.